Hey everybody, welcome to our lecture series for this year. My name is Marie-Joelle. I'm a professor in political science and a research director at PARCC here at Maxwell. And this is the first guest lecture in a series that's part of a project that I have just launched along with my colleague Bruce Dayton, who's the associate director at the Moynihan Institute. And the project looks at spoilers of peace. And in doing that, we've organized a group of faculty and graduate students, some 15 of us here at Maxwell, to think about how peace processes break down, the ways in which both participants in peace negotiations and those external to those negotiations can derail peace processes intentionally, unintentionally. We look at how international actors can also be spoilers, and the project is really meant to problematize what we mean by spoiling. That is, in what instances can spoiling actually lead to better peace outcomes and more durable peace? In what cases and circumstances are spoilers actually freedom fighters? And actually, in fact, actors who have legitimate beefs with the process and may be excluded from it. So there's various angles that we're coming at in this project, and it is cross-regional. And we have a number of graduate students involved throughout different Maxwell programs who are participating and are here today as well. And it's a real pleasure to have with us one of the leading experts who has looked at peace agreements, peace processes, multiple case studies in her work. So it's a pleasure to welcome Marie-Joëlle Zahar from the Université de Montréal. She is an associate professor of political science and also a research director of the Francophone Peace Operations Network Center in the International Research and Studies program in Montreal. She received her Ph.D. from McGill University, and she's been a research fellow at the prestigious Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. She's also co-editor with Stephen Saideman of Intra-State Conflict, Government and Security, Dilemmas of Deterrence and Assurance, a book that was published last year, and she's had numerous articles on peacebuilding and post-conflict transitions in multiple journals. She's also been a former consultant for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. She's been a faculty member at the Pearson Peacekeeping Centre. She's served on the board of directors of the Canadian Political Science Association, and she's been a research director of the Middle East Network at the University of Montreal as well. So really a very illustrious career, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Today, Professor Zahar will speak on intervening to build peace, peace-building strategies, and violence in war-to-peace transitions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zahar.
Thanks. Thank you a lot, Miriam and Bruce, for the invitation. It's one of the pleasures of academics to actually find other people who are as interested in their topics as they are themselves. So this was not only an opportunity to meet colleagues who, some of them I knew worked in similar areas and I didn't really have the opportunity to really meet before, but also earlier on today to get acquainted with a bunch of very impressive graduate students who put me to the test and asked me some tough questions, and I hope that the answers didn't disappoint a lot. Let me, if I manage to get this thing to work, yes. Let me tell you what motivates this research. You have a bit of a gory picture here of a UNITA leader, Jonas Savimbi, when he was killed and captured by the government of Angola, putting an end to the civil war in that country. What motivates the talk is a concern with groups that are brought into peace processes, what we call in the jargon of the field insiders, people who are brought into peace processes and decide at various points for different reasons to actually use violence and step out of those processes, many times derailing the whole process. Savimbi is a case in point. He was essential to the agreements back in the early 1990s that were supposed to bring an end to the war in Angola, a war that had started pretty much at the time of the independence of the country in 1975. His failure to win, according to his expectations, the presidency in the first post-war elections resulted in him getting out of the peace process and back to the bush. And it took from 1992 to 2002, when he was killed, to actually bring the war to an end. So the question that is of interest to me, yes, maybe, these things are not as good as they appear, is how do we think about the violence of insiders? And what impact does our thinking about this violence have on the sustainability of peace? Groups are presumably brought into peace processes, either because we think that they are absolutely necessary to get the process going, or because we think that they have an interest in peace. And the violence of insiders poses, therefore, a more acute theoretical and practical challenge to us than the violence of groups that are left out. Because presumably it means that either the international community, the do-gooders who try and bring peace to these countries, have been awfully wrong in their assessment of which groups are partners in this enterprise. And what happened in Angola is not a single exception. It is actually part of a string of cases in which groups and actors have been brought into peace processes only to walk out and decide to basically give up on the whole enterprise. Or it is that the only reason why groups accept peace is because that they get something in return, and therefore it's not peace per se that they think they're pursuing. It is more that they're pursuing other objectives that they think peace is going to allow them to achieve. In which case, strategic deception is always a problem, and one might ask the question, if groups are not interested in peace, then should the international community intervene in such situations? The theoretical question that this brings me to is there a way of generating loyalty to a peace process? And are the strategies needed to generate this loyalty different depending on the types of actors that we bring into the enterprise? I'm going to propose a way of starting to think about this, and this is what I would call relatively preliminary work. This work is based, like other work of mine in this field, on an adaptation of Albert Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty framework that I will get to later on. But what I find interesting about this is that this adaptation allows us to think about different types of strategies that are currently being used by outsiders as they try and intervene to build peace in war-torn societies. I'm going to suggest that our strategies are often inappropriate, that where they are appropriate, they face serious logistical challenges, that as an international community, and I'm going to use the term we between very heavy quotes as a shortcut, not to talk about the UN and other actors who intervene in these situations, that we are not collectively willing to bear. We're not willing to bear the logistical costs that appropriate strategies entail. And I'm going to actually leave you with what I think this means, both for our research in this area, but also for the practice of interveners who want to try and help societies come out of a cycle of violence. So I have two key questions that I want to address today. The first is, when do insiders use violence in peace processes? What do we know about this? And is our knowledge satisfactory, or do we need to actually rethink some of our assumptions? And second, what can what we call custodians of peace do to build sustainable peace processes? And as you see here, there's a little sample, which is neither representative nor exhaustive, of the type of situations that we're talking about. Bosnia post-Dayton, Kosovo, Afghanistan post-2001, 2002, and so on and so forth. In all of these cases, we have heavy international intervention, which at least rhetorically claims to want and build sustainable peace and help groups come out of violence. Are we succeeding? If yes, why? If not, why not? My preliminary answers are going to be very simple. I don't think that I've discovered the atom here. But I think that we can safely say that the reasons that drive actors to enter into peace processes need to be understood. And these reasons may have to do with context. They may have to do with process. They may also have to do with a set of perceptions and motivations that I will get back to, but which I did not include here. And custodians who are interested in building sustainable peace can try and neutralize the environment in such a way as to make it difficult for groups to really be able to use violence by doing things such as demilitarizing, demobilizing, or by trying to impose arm embargoes to make sure that none of the actors involved in peace processes really has the means of actually building on the side the capabilities of returning to violence. That is the focus of most of the research to date, neutralization of the environment. The thing that I want to suggest is that custodians of peace can also try and generate loyalty to the process. And I'm suggesting that peace implementation strategies matter. They matter in that they affect the way in which actors, both those who are brought into the processes and those who are left out, interpret and react to the objectives of the custodians. Loyalty is not something new. Again, no major discovery here. However, what I want to suggest is that the way in which we think about generating loyalty is currently underspecified, and that there's something that we need to do to move this agenda further. Maybe. Limited range. Why is that important? To avoid the kind of investments that go literally to smoke, such as what happened in 2004 when, after years of heavy, expensive investment in trying to build peace in Kosovo, the United Nations found itself the target of riots by Serbs and Kosovar Albanians dissatisfied with the implementation of the agreement that brought the violence in this then province of Serbia to an end. So what do we know about insider violence? And perforce, since I want to leave time for Q&A, I'm trying to generalize, and maybe I caricature a little bit, our knowledge in the process. What we think we know is that insider violence is, as Miriam suggested in her introduction, spoiling. Spoiling defined by Steve Saideman in his seminal article that actually started the whole debate on spoiling as the use of violence intended to derail peace. We also think that violence is a proof of strategic deception. And so going back to issues of motivations, that the groups were never really serious about peace, that in fact they only entered into the process to gain some breathing space, regroup, gather their forces, and get ready, get a strategic advantage for the next round. Some of the work of Saideman in 2003 and some of the work by Greenhill and Major goes in that direction. A third type of explanation suggests that insiders will use violence because even though they may be serious about peace, they are not capable of fully trusting their former enemies. And so, when push comes to shove, when the hard test of giving up the one means of defending yourself against the eventual deception of the other, that is your weapons, when that happens, when you get to that point, groups will balk, refuse to disarm, and their refusal to disarm is going to generate violence. In many ways, that was the big concern over IRA unease with the idea of DDR and the Northern Ireland peace process. In general, these are the ways in which we frame insider violence nowadays. As I suggested in my preliminary answer, it seems to me that we fail to consider the impact that outside actors, international interveners, who come in with full force, with a very extensive and impressive panoply of instruments in these situations, can have on the perceptions and the strategies of the actors. We tend to think of these outside interveners or custodians as groups that come in animated with good intentions and that actually react to situations, might therefore, as they did in Kosovo, have to consider using a limited amount of force when they find themselves in front of a situation bordering chaos. But outsiders are not the only ones that react. We do not pay as much attention to the fact that local actors, be they governments or the various warring factions, or even political groups, are going to interpret the presence, the strategies, and the stated objectives of outsiders as part of the environment, of the strategic environment in which they are going to operate. And therefore, I think that we need a better appreciation of the manner in which our intervention strategies affect the context and the evaluations that local actors make of what is available to them in terms of needs and what is happening with their conflict, what is happening with their society under the umbrella of this international intervention. To do so, I think that we need to go back to the notion of loyalty. Because in many senses, in every sense of the word, in fact, if the international community comes in and whatever strategy it uses is perceived not so much as a way of building something that everyone can agree with, but as building something that might benefit some at the expense of others, the chances of failure are very high. And so, for the actors that we have brought in as partners in those peace processes, it is important to be able to really secure not just their compliance, but also their loyalty to the process, to give them a stake in the whole enterprise. And to think about loyalty, I go back to Albert Hirschman, who studied this phenomenon in, of course, the context of organizations, markets, and firms. Hirschman proposed back in 1970 a deceptively simple but powerful framework in which he basically said that dissatisfied groups had two options. One option was to actually leave the organization they belonged to and go to the competition, which he described as basically the typical economic response. You don't like one supplier, you go to the other. You play the market. Or, basically, try and exert voice. In other words, try and affect the decisions, the objectives, the process of your organization so that you feel that you are more in sync with it. Voice is, of course, a political response. It is what we do when we go to the polls, of course, and try and vote to affect the outcome, to try and indicate in which way we want our government to go. Because this way we're identifying a set of policies that we feel more comfortable with. It is what people do when they actually, instead of leaving a party, open debates within parties to try and change internal politics that might be problematic. And for Hirschman, loyalty is the determinant between choosing voice or exit. If you don't have loyalty to an organization, it'll be very easy to exit and go to another one. If you have loyalty, you will be more likely to actually try and influence the process before you slam the door. People who took Hirschman's framework tried to think about loyalty in the context of organizations and firms. And in fact, they suggest that there are three different kinds of behaviors that can all be construed as loyalty, but which are motivated by very different kind of reasons. The first is what they call instrumental loyalty. In other terms, you stay in because you're getting some benefits. Instrumental loyalty, for those of you who are political scientists, is basically what we suggest happens in rentier states where the government showers citizens with all kinds of freebies in return for their consent to the rule of the governing few. This loyalty is only as sustainable as the benefits that accrue from it. Once the benefits disappear, once they start fraying, this kind of loyalty will be put to the test. The second kind of loyalty is process-based loyalty. You stay in because you think that you can still affect the outcome. You stay in because you are participating, you're brought into the decision structures. This is what happens when, for example, going back to political parties that have internal schisms, members of the minority faction are brought into the governing structures of the party as a way of indicating that their opinion matters. And they stay within the party because they hope to be able to affect change. If and when that does not happen, if they are shut out of the decisional structures, then they are more likely to leave. The third and strongest kind of loyalty that organizational theorists have identified is value-based loyalty. You stay in because in spite of your discomfort with some aspects, you wholeheartedly believe in the goals and objectives, the principles and the ideals that underpin the enterprise that you are part of. Value-based loyalty, I like to say with a bit of a wink, is the reason why pretty much every UN bureaucrat or UN employee I've known has complained a lot about all that's wrong with the UN, but still find no other way of really trying to achieve peace, security at the level of the international system. They stay in not because they think that the organization is perfect, but they think that the organization's goals are worth. And therefore, they try and reform it from inside, with, I would say, relatively little success. But that is a topic for another talk. Oops. Maybe. Yeah. How does that help me think about peace processes and about insider violence? Because, in fact, I find a very interesting parallel between these three types of loyalties and what Steve Saideman, who started the whole debate on spoiling, calls three meanings of peace implementation, what in fact amount to three different strategies of pursuing peace. The first is compliance. The second, process or voice. And the third, Saideman defines as peace building. The first would be the equivalent of coercive peace enforcement. The second would be the equivalent of building shared institutions, ensuring that there is power sharing among the various actors in the decision-making at the level of the state. And the third, peace building, is trying to transform society, to move it towards some sort of deeper reconciliation along the lines of the work of Louis Priestley. These three meanings, to me, and I'm going to develop that, are very strongly connected to what I see as the development of instrumental loyalty, process-based loyalty, and value-based loyalty. And I think that that is actually very important to assess the kind of interventions that we have nowadays, the limits of these interventions, and the promises that are still unfulfilled. Pictures, which I think of as representing, of course, these three meanings of peace implementation. S4 in Bosnia. Beat them into accepting it. Jerry Lewis and Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland. Convince them that they can live together and that they can make joint decisions. That didn't go very well. It is still a painful process, but at least it did not revert to violence. And reconciliation meetings in Papua New Guinea bring the society together to talk about what is wrong and to try and develop ways of moving forward. Involve not only the leaders and the armed forces, but also the people who are supposed to be the ultimate stakeholders and the reasons why we intervene. So what do we know about these intervention strategies and the kind of loyalties that they foster? Compliance. Compliance is defined as a legalistic fulfillment of obligations. It is a peace-building strategy which brings actors to the table, to the negotiating table, defines a number of objectives in a peace agreement, and holds actors accountable to the respect of these objectives. Often, the respect of the objectives has the backbone of a very powerful military deterrent. The attachments that the armed actors, the insiders, have to the process is a function of expected gains from this process. Limited gains, but expected gains nevertheless. For example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats were partially convinced by the agreement because it gave them the ability to continue to develop what they thought were communal types of attachments in politics, separate from the central state, because it divvied up powers in such a way that the Bosnian Serbs, more than the Bosnian Croats, had their own entity and were able to have control over their own affairs. But the problem with compliance is that as soon as the benefits stop accruing, or when the benefits accrue but war gains are greater, in a sense you feel like that you can benefit from a return to war more than you can from staying within the peace process, then insiders will use violence, and that violence will be spoiling, because its point will be to derail the process. That is what many observers of Bosnia and Herzegovina fear is happening nowadays. I don't know how many of you are aware of that, because we all think of Bosnia as a glaring example of success, where, you know, with the strength of NATO and the goodwill of the international community, billions of dollars, we have built a country and have prevented, you know, the various groups from achieving the independence that they wanted as their stated war aim. Well, actually, nowadays, the actors who are very much the same groups that were fighting each other during the war, and that I think is a very significant sign when 15 years down the road, it is still the same people who are in power. The actors are starting to rethink their attachment to the Dayton Peace Agreement, because the international community is trying to push them to give away some of the powers that they consider to be gains from Dayton in order to build a more functional central state. Because the current situation is such that the autonomy of the various entities, and that's how they call the equivalent of states or provinces in Bosnia, the autonomy of the entities is so big that it actually is handicapping the functioning of the central government, and is making Bosnia a place where nothing can happen politically at the central level. For the first time last year, EUFOR, so your EU force commanders deployed in replacement of the S4, which was NATO's deterrent backbone in Bosnia, admitted that there might be a possibility of reverting to violence should they exit, because nowadays not only the Serbs but also the Croats are putting into question the agreement that was signed. Compliance, therefore, builds what I would call, as a shorthand, fickle loyalty. Process is supposed to be a bit more successful. The idea here is, of course, to try and provide a structure that allows all the groups to be present at the table, not just during the negotiations, but also in the running of the country post-transition. I'm not going to say post-conflict. And to ensure that they won't feel the commitment problem that I talked about earlier on. They won't feel threatened with elimination, because they will all have their own divvied up parts or representation in the state. In terms of strategies, this empirically is more often than not, in the majority of cases, associated with the development of some sort of power-sharing institutions. Power-sharing institutions in which you give Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks 1/3 each of the seats in parliament, or you divide representation in Northern Ireland between Republicans and excuse me, I'm blanking out, and loyalists. I'm thinking of the word in French. That's what happens at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Sorry. And loyalists. Or in Lebanon, you have this very complicated exercise where basically it's half Christians, half Muslims, but then again, within each group, you make sure that, Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants, whatever, each get their own share proportional to their demographic representation in the society. This loyalty works as long as the institutions fulfill their role. As long as people feel that they actually have a meaningful way of expressing differences at the table. The moment institutions fail to perform their role, the moment the power sharing, for whatever reason, and there are a lot of reasons that might explain this, becomes captured by one group that tries to impose its own way of doing things on the rest, the whole thing crumbles. In other terms, the kind of process-based loyalty that we are developing here puts the onus of the success of our intervention on fragile, often nascent institutions, which are very ill-equipped on their own to really do the job. The power-sharing institutions that have been established around the globe at the behest of the international community often exceed by far the political capacity, the political skills, and the basic human resources that are needed to man them and to make sure that they function efficiently. They are often established also in contexts where people have no history of dealing with this kind of continuous negotiation of differences, and therefore where basic skills needed to make the institutions work are absent. I'll give you a very shorthand of an example here. I've been involved in the last couple of years in a capacity building project with Iraqi parliamentarians. The idea being that the Iraqis have introduced a federal system of governance that is supposed to help them all have a stake in the process. But they don't really know much about federalism. Well, it's even deeper than that. Many of the people who have been actually elected to parliament don't even know the basic workings of a parliamentarian system. They don't know how to bring about a bill, how to draft it, what the process is of getting it through parliament, what it means and how to actually go ahead and convince other groups to make alliances and make sure those bills are passed. So basic skills are absent. In Afghanistan, it's even worse. Many of the parliamentarians can't even read the bills they're supposed to be voting on. In other words, process-based loyalty is not a bad idea. However, it presupposes a level of knowledge, expertise, and sophistication that is often absent in these societies. It does therefore need, if it is to be given a chance, a lot of support from the outside, like a baby that is accompanied by parents until it grows. That support is often absent. Finally, strategies of peace implementation as peace building. The idea here, and I think that, at the Maxwell School, people are very familiar with this approach, and I'm going to be doing injustice to it, so Louis, my apologies. It's to forge meaningful long-term relationship between former enemies, but relationships that are based on developing some sort of common objectives. The idea of getting people to build something together. It is a process of deep societal transformation. And of all these meanings and strategies of peace implementation, it is the only one that actually pays serious attention to the role of society in really entrenching and rooting those processes. However, and unfortunately for all of us, maybe, well, I'm returning this. It needs close contact. Unfortunately, peace implementation in the current international context in which we are more often means compliance and or process than it does mean peace building. The international actors with the capacity and the resources to actually help and intervene in building peace are much more likely to privilege the first two meanings of peace implementation than the third. And it's no wonder, of course, that the third, where it happens at the initiative of NGOs, of societal international actors, and not at the behest of states or international organizations. But that has actually consequences. And that has consequences both for our research and for our practice. The consequences of this approach to loyalty seem to me to play out in two different ways. First of all, they bring up something that I had neglected at the beginning to mention, which is thinking about the roots of insider violence. What are the motivations? Not just thinking about process and context. And trying to think hard, when is violence spoiling and when is it not? I suggested that in the case where the only reason actors use violence is to derail the process because they're simply not satisfied with the material benefits from it and think that they can get better benefits by returning to war, that to me would be the closest case in which we could call it spoiling. However, if the violence is an expression of dissatisfaction with the ability of the institutions to really perform their role of representation, then I think that it would be a sleight of hand to call it spoiling, because we would be looking at the expression, not the root cause of the problem, and we'd be dealing with the consequences as opposed to trying to deal with the roots. It seems to me that this, of course, has implications both for our analysis of the spoiler debate, and I would personally urge us to not use the term, but maybe think about alternative terms, because the term is too loaded in terms of its conflation between methods and ends. And this also has implications for our intervention strategies when we want to actually build peace. Which brings me to reframing the role and responsibilities of custodians. The politics of peace implementation are seriously constrained, and we all know this, so I'm not even going to develop this idea much, by financial and other types of human, moral, political considerations. There are a lot of places in the world that need help. Resources are strapped, all the more so when we are going through a financial crisis, upheaval, recession, on the scale of the entire planet. And governments have cold feet when it comes to explaining why soldiers should go and die in foreign lands. Iraq might be an exception, Afghanistan might be less of an exception, but these are exceptions to the rule. It is very difficult for governments to explain why they should send soldiers to places like Somalia, the DRC, Sudan, to try and solve what looks like really long and protracted conflicts. The politics of peace implementation, the fact that our governments, if and when they want to intervene, and I'm assuming that they want to intervene for the good reasons, are still constrained by finances and by the political pressures that sending young people to die away for something that is not in the national interest can create for governments. And that translates into pressures for early exit. But it is exactly those pressures for early exit, to go and do something and get out, that I think are at the root of our privileging compliance and process over peacebuilding. Because compliance and process allows us to have at least a semblance of stability and to say, check, the job has been done. The pressures of early exit also, in terms of practice, mean that nowadays there is talk for the need for coercive implementation. We hear a lot about armed humanitarianism, about the responsibility to protect, intervention, what have you. But all of this suggests that if groups don't want to be reasoned with, then we should go in, tame them, and go out. As I suggested earlier, this has consequences for the types of loyalty or lack of loyalty that develop in terms of, the outcomes that we hope to achieve, sustainable peace. In conclusion, what does that mean? I think this suggests that intervention strategies need to be thought of very carefully, much more so than they are right now. And if we are serious about the moral commitment to intervene to build peace, then we need to use the appropriate strategy in the appropriate place. Process might be good enough in Northern Ireland. It may not be sufficient in the Sudan. I think we need to do more work to try and understand which strategies are appropriate for which types of context, which sets of strategies are appropriate for which types of contexts, because these strategies are not mutually exclusive. But that creates political and moral dilemmas. Political dilemmas because if we are serious about thinking about intervention strategies, we need to secure the commitment of this international community to go in and stay in as long as it takes to really achieve positive peace, sustainable peace. The second dilemma is a dilemma of the choice of right local partners. Our tendency has been to take the armed factions, whoever they are, and to bring them around the table. And that is an impulse that is pragmatically totally justified. You need to silence the guns, and therefore you need to get those guys at the table and to get them to initiate the peace agreements. However, what we also know is that if we only bring this kind of groups to the table, oftentimes we end up with situations in which we may have stability, but we have authoritarian stability. These groups are not likely to really open up the political space for others. In other terms, what we are building is a situation which 10, 15 years down the road might create occasions for different but related kinds of violence. Are we willing to bring in the right partners? I think I'll leave that to the discussion, but often the groups that we leave on the outside, on the fringes of peace processes, are exactly the ones that we need to bring in. And the considerations why we select some groups over others are not always analytically sound if we're serious about sustainability. And then there's a moral dilemma that I want to flag in closing. That's the danger of intervention orphans, along the lines of the notion of aid orphans. If we are serious and we think about appropriate strategies for appropriate contexts, we need to secure commitment and to find the right local partners. Does that mean that there are situations in which we cannot really have a serious chance, a reasonable chance of success at the starting point? And does that mean that in these situations it is better for the international community not to intervene because it might do more harm than good? That is a moral dilemma that I think we need to flag and that we need to think about as we forge ahead, trying to understand what it is that the international community is doing in these places and how does that affect the choices of local actors to resort or not to resort to violence. Thank you. Oops, I've gone too
plenty of time for questions, comments. Please.
How do you see the framework or the peace process going in, especially the Darfur region, considering that the government of Sudan is also having to deal with the civil war that's been going on for 50 some odd years? Or is it even possible in the next decade?
Let me start by saying something that might not be common knowledge, because things are happening in the Sudan that are not making the front page of our media. But I think that right now, Darfur is the least problem of the Sudan. In the last week, more than 1,000 people have died in the south in internal conflict, and we don't know, the international community, in spite of presence in the region, is not able to figure out who is using violence and why they are using violence. What we know is this is not the same scenario as the Darfur, in the sense that it doesn't seem to be a fight between herders and farmers over land. It seems to be something different, but it's something that's happening in the context of forthcoming elections, which are going to pave the way for a referendum for the secession of the South. So, in many ways, accusations are being traded all over the country, but we know very little. I think that the situation in the Sudan, especially what the international community, particularly the US government, has tried to do in terms of resolving the conflict between the South and the North, shows exactly the limits of the approaches that I've tried to pinpoint here. The way in which we have tried to bring an end to this very long conflict, as you pointed out, is by developing some sort of power sharing, giving the South autonomy over its own affairs, but giving it also representation in the government, in the central government in Khartoum. Problem with that is that the SPLA and the SPLM, so the army and the movement that were basically fighting in the South, had very little capacity. And so, for the first 2 years actually, following the agreement, they didn't have qualified people to really take and exercise the responsibilities that had been given to them. So, for example, there is an agreement that allows or forces the government in Khartoum to give the government of the South, the GOSS, a certain proportion of oil earnings that should go for the development of institutions in the South. That money has stayed in bank accounts for 2 years because there was no one who was able to really figure out what to do with it. Such is the capacity gap in the GOSS. It is so bad that I found out when I was in Sudan back in June that the University of Juba, which is supposed to be the University of the South, is located in Khartoum, and most of the professors dread the moment in a couple of months when they're going to be forced to go and to move the university to Juba, because in Juba you don't have electricity, you don't really have any kind of structures to live in. People live in containers. It is so minimal that these people who are accustomed basically to the comfort of the capital don't want to go to Juba. We're talking about the people who are the few who have the capacity to help build something in the south of Sudan. That is, I think, a glaring illustration of the kind of problems with process and the onus we are putting on institutions which cannot function for very obvious reasons. The starting point is too low, is too weak in many ways. I can't find the right term, but basically we're starting with light years behind any power sharing agreement that might have a chance to succeed. That's why I think that power sharing is much more likely to succeed in Northern Ireland, for example, than it is in the Sudan. there are structural, contextual capacity issues that make it impossible in the Sudan, short of a miracle, for power sharing to really work. Now, the other problem with power sharing in the Sudan is that this capacity gap has actually been used and abused by the government in Khartoum, which is not interested in sharing power, to try and basically carve again a source of autonomy and to regain some of the powers it was supposed to be giving to the government in the south. And so the government in Khartoum was supposed to give seats in the finance ministry, in a number of key ministries, to representatives of the GOSS. They've never been invited in. And that is a source of tension. So it seems to me that, in terms of that, therefore, what that suggests is that process is not going to be sufficient. I think that looking at Darfur as simply a problem between the government and the people ignores, and I'm going to finish on that, ignores the reality that this is also, first and foremost, a conflict at the level of society for access to land, which is very valuable, very rare in this region, which has been instrumentalized and politicized. But if we don't deal with all the levels of the conflict, if we don't really understand what is going on, we are going to create a solution that is not going to be appropriate and that will crumble down the road. Yep.
Can you please share with us our views about situations in which incited violence is not used as an exit strategy? For example, if we have negotiation parties that are engaged in violence throughout the negotiation process, or a negotiating party that goes into specific terms of violent actions in order to leverage the position within the process itself.
I think that limited insider violence can indeed not be spoiling. And I'm going to give you an example from Mozambique during the negotiating process. And so between the time the accords were signed, the San Remo Accords were signed, and the time that the first elections were held. Let me get back to those facts because Mozambique is a case that I haven't looked at in a couple of years. Part of the agreement that brought the war in Mozambique to an end had security provisions concerning corridors that were used by the rebels, by Renamo, to access weapons and resources in neighboring countries. And the government actually asked for control of these corridors. The agreement was that they would be controlled by the international community, but that no one would be able to use them. About, I'd say, a couple of months after the agreement was signed, there were reports that the corridors were being used by the government forces to actually go and buy weapons. And the reports were documented by the UN. Renamo, at the time an insider to the peace process, tried to make a case for this to become public and for the government to be admonished. It wasn't. There was a short interval of a couple of weeks during which Renamo basically withdrew its support to the process and started remobilizing its soldiers. And there were a few skirmishes here and there around the corridors. The violence of Renamo could not be construed as spoiling the process. It was actually a reaction, and that's why I say that intervention strategies by outsiders as well are very important. It was a reaction to the inability of the international community to really take the government to task, or the unwillingness of the international community to take the government to task. That, I think, is the kind of example that we're thinking about. Insider violence can be an expression of disagreement with the way things are going. I'll give you an example from Lebanon. Another case that, I think is problematic in the way in which we read it. You probably know that in Lebanon, the power sharing formula that was agreed back in 1989 at Taif in Saudi Arabia was supposed to rebalance the distribution of power between the communities, stripping some powers away from the Christians and giving a bit more powers to Muslims. The idea being that Muslims were underrepresented in proportion to their real demographic weight in the country, and that the Christians had actually played a number game to maintain themselves in power. For a number of reasons, the powers that were given to Muslim politicians, the most important powers, went to the Sunnis. So there was a bit of a reshuffle of the cards, but not a total reshuffle of the cards. And that went well as long as everyone felt that they were having a voice in the process. So Shia were very much represented in parliament. They had portfolios in all governments. They had the speakership of the House, but they were not demanding more than that. And then came 2004 to 2008. What happened between 2004 and 2008 was an unfortunate association between internal problems in Lebanon and broader regional and international problems, in which the main Shia group, the Hezbollah, had serious claims in terms of the workings of the political system in Lebanon. Oh, that's nice. But it also was engaged in acts of violence against Israel, and therefore earned itself the label of terrorist. That label was very skillfully used by its internal opponents to basically delegitimize all the claims it had on, things working poorly within the Lebanese government. And so basically, because Hezbollah had what, most people would agree were very problematic and aggressive policies regionally, the things that they were demanding internally and which were totally justified got shoved aside. And Hezbollah, for the first time since its inception in May of 2008, used violence against other Lebanese in an attempt to make itself heard. Without condoning the violence, I think that calling it spoiling, an attempt to derail peace in Lebanon, would be a myopic interpretation of what happened. There are serious problems with the power sharing formula in Lebanon. Everyone knows about them. The fact that these problems affect particularly one community, and the fact that the main representative of this community also happens to be involved in acts of violence that are labeled terrorism across the border, should not mean that the claims get shoved aside. The violence of Hezbollah internally, it seems to me, was a desperate, inappropriate, which actually hurt it a lot, attempt at making its case at a point when all the other venues were being closed in front of it because it was being called a terrorist group, and therefore neither the government of Lebanon nor the foreign powers that were trying to intervene to solve the situation in Lebanon wanted to give it a hearing. That is another case that I think is symptomatic of what happens when you have internal violence and you automatically call it spoiling. The violence of Hezbollah in terms of the regional of the regional situation, you could call spoiling of the peace process, though defunct, between Arabs and Israelis. That violence is spoiling, but the violence of Hezbollah internally was not spoiling. And I think that nuance is important and needs to be kept. Yeah.
I was interested in the peace-building strategy that you mentioned. It seems like a very local kind of solution, building relationships, the role of society. So what role can an outside actor play in that?
Outside actors can play tremendous roles in that. Many societies that have gone through long and very bloody conflicts have lost the bridges and the ties that brought communities together. The first thing that goes in a conflict is civil society of the bridging kind. You have a lot of communal life within communities, but as soon as conflicts are protracted, and especially where various groups manage to control their own zones exclusive of each other, connections get lost. And it's very difficult to re-establish those connections for a number of reasons. In part because those who want to may fear the reaction of the armed groups in their midst. In part also because they may not even know if they have interlocutors on the other side. In part because they might not know how to do it and where to do it. Green lines are not the most auspicious place to hold this kind of activities. Green lines are also places where sniping is a favorite activity of militiamen, and people lose their lives, civilians lose their lives at places like that. And outside actors, NGOs, religious communities, whatever, can actually provide the safe havens and serve as the connecting points in the same way that mediators often do the back and forth between various protagonists, to bring these groups together, to give them the ability to share the fact that they have a common vision, they have a common goal, and to help them work on it. And in many of the places that we've been talking about, whether it be Bosnia, Mozambique, Angola, most of the successful initiatives, the ones that have lasted even though the political situation might have deteriorated, even in places like Israel and Palestine, are initiatives that have been established or taken at the behest of international groups. There are actually groups that have made an expertise for themselves in that field. The Community of San Egidio in Rome. Conciliation Resources, a think tank based in the UK. These are groups that have actually a long history. They have established credibility in bringing societal actors together to work, to unite, and to form some sort of third voice, a voice that is not often heard in the more formal processes that involve political or military actors. And these are the kind of actors that everyone now clamors should be included in peace processes. They are increasingly at the table, but they don't have the same clout, leverage, or presence at the table as the other actors do. And, from a practical point of view, that is a problem. Analytically, it's understandable. For all kinds of good reasons, they don't have the same political and or military resources. They're less organized. They don't have the same strong identities and cohesion as groups and what have you. But practically, that is a problem, because these are the constituencies of peace that you want involved in the process from the very beginning, so that the process can take root. Going back to the example of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, though it's not a civil war, shares a lot of, characteristics with, the kind of peace implementation strategies I've been talking about in civil wars. The big gamble, and I think in retrospect the big problem, was to think that the leaders on both sides would be able to sell peace to their societies, and that would be sufficient to pull the process along. It was only when things started getting really bad, so in the mid-1980s, in the mid-1990s, that initiatives financed, organized, among others, by people in the United States close to government circles, tried to think about the way in which to bring Israelis and Palestinians together at the level of society, to make them understand what was going on and why that was good for them. But it was too late. The violence had already started again. And it was very difficult to stem the tide of the violence then. But I think that is something that, again, is empirically important, and that analytically we kind of pay lip service to, but we don't really think about in terms of what kind of arguments, what kind of theories, what kinds of research we need to make to really bring forth very forcefully the importance of these groups for the sustainability of peace. And whatever little research there is exemplified by the work of Louis Griesberg here, or the work of Jean-Paul Lederach, or what is happening in Scandinavian countries around Johan Galtung and his group. But these are exceptions, they're not rules. Yeah.
Thank you for this really provocative talk. I have 2 points that I actually want to push you a bit. I'm not sure whether I agree with myself yet or not, so I'm playing devil's advocate.
I'm not sure that I agree with myself fully. As I said, this is preliminary.
I really find, your distinction between compliance, process, and peace building very useful. And I think you're right that international actors have tended to privilege the first two rather than the third. But, I do wonder how easy it is to start off with the peace building side of things, even though certainly that is the way to get lasting peace and a positive peace, building long-term relationships, societal transformation, shared value. But it takes a long time. And part of the reason it takes such a long time is because at the level of society, you've got whole generations that have been seeped in these very negative images of the other, from media and bombarded with this stuff from when they're little kids, textbooks, everything. So you got to change all that. It might even take a generational shift. Or two. So that in some of these cases, you might find that it's actually the elites who are more moderate, who are less radical than society. So starting with first getting those groups to realize that the costs of war are higher than going into a peace process, that you could actually have voice in a negotiated outcome, that you can build the institutions first to get that access and voice. That might be what's first needed, even as maybe in tandem you start to change at the societal level. So that it's not a choice of forget the compliance and process, go straight for the peace building, but maybe pursue these two, but don't forget to keep pursuing this. It's going to take a much longer time than these other two. And if you keep pursuing at the societal level, when the elites start messing it up, maybe society will be at the point to say, hey, you elites, there's actually another alternative. And maybe that's also a way to explain the Irish case, where society actually began to self-police the real IRA and say, that's not the alternative we want anymore. So that's one question I had with the framework. And the other one was on your point about how when is violence not spoiling? And I think, I think I agree with you that using violence to make yourself heard is something different than using violence when you realize that you have more benefits to be had by going to war. I think that, when you're left out, there is some sort of legitimate beef that an actor might have. But even though we may recognize that the group, as you mentioned, Hezbollah, may be desperate, may be aggrieved by the reneging of the others, isn't there a different way to go about voicing that dissatisfaction than blowing people up, than killing people? Can't you do some nonviolent protests? Don't we have to ultimately hold the group responsible for the actions that they choose, even though we recognize that their motivations have some legitimacy? Don't we ultimately have to say, you know what? This action you cannot do, for no matter what legitimate motive you have. You cannot blow people up in the downtown cafe or in the mall. Can't do it. Even though we recognize that you have this legitimate beef with the process, that you've been kind of left out, there are other ways to voice that dissatisfaction.
So let me take up this one first. Not because I think it's the easiest, but because I think the answer is fresh in my mind to this one. I'm also going to be in agreement and in disagreement with myself here. It seems to me that I fully agree with you that there are certain types of violence that are so reprehensible that even though they might be understandable, they are not justifiable. Okay? Having said that, that is why I think it is important to really work hard at not misconstruing actors' intentions and actions so that they don't get to this point. And I'm going to use the Hezbollah case as a case in point. Hezbollah was in government for the first time in its life when Resolution 1701 was passed at the Security Council calling for its disarmament. And in recognition of the fact that this was a very problematic and delicate situation, a committee was organized at the behest of the government of the Republic at the time in Lebanon, including representatives of all parties, including Hezbollah, to discuss ways of solving some of these pending issues, including the weapons of Hezbollah, the eventual disarming and reintegration of Hezbollah fighters into the army. And even Terry Rod-Larson recognized, acknowledged that this committee was making progress. And then came the assassination in Lebanon of Rafiq Hariri. And things got polarized. When things got polarized and Hezbollah was basically... Hezbollah got to the point where it withdrew from government. There was the War of 2006. The War of 2006, I think, is a clear case of aggression. Hezbollah went across the border and attacked an Israeli patrol on Israeli territory. Now, there were all kinds of discussions as to whether or not they expected the reaction they got, what have you. I think that is irrelevant. What is important is what happened internally after that. When the situation between Hezbollah and the government became so tense, they did not immediately use weapons. For 14 months, they set up tents around the government, effectively forcing the prime minister to stay in his office for 14 months, besieged. And they had what was, for all intents and purposes, a very disruptive, politically, but non-violent protest. It was after that, and after the failure of that protest to achieve anything, that the violence occurred. So my first attempt at an answer is, these are processes, they take a long time. What is important is not to move the process in the wrong direction. And I think that the government of Lebanon, by playing the terrorist card, playing the association of internal problems with external dynamics, by fusing the two paths, actually contributed to cornering Hezbollah and putting it in a situation where it used violence. I think that there is another challenge which is analytical for us. Not only to think about what types of violence constitute spoiling, but also to think about, when and under what conditions do groups use certain kinds of violence. Hezbollah, much like other groups, has resorted to very different kinds of violence. Military engagements, bombings, more recently, targeted attacks against individuals. And it has also targeted, at various points in time, members of its own community, members of other Lebanese communities, and Israeli civilians, and of course Israeli armed force personnel. I think that we know very little about when, why, and how groups use certain types of violence as opposed to others, and whether there's a way for us to nudge them to use less lethal and therefore, maybe understandable but also justifiable types of violence. I think that in Lebanon, for example, people hold Hezbollah to task for the fact that they think, certain types of violence are not justifiable. And Hezbollah has lost a lot of support, which it had when it was using guerrilla tactics, because they thought that that was both understandable and justifiable. So I think that that's yet another tack, I think, of research that we need to really take on if we want to understand these things seriously. It's a huge enterprise. And we're at the very, very, very beginning. I mean, we're only now starting to admit that these non-state groups have politics, have internal factions. We used to describe them as monoliths of, roving thugs. It's a young research program. I think what is important from my perspective, I realize we can't get the answers right away. What is important is to make sure that we are going in the right direction to get the right type of answers, the ones that are going to enable us to make a difference in the real world. On the other question, I wholeheartedly agree with you on the issue that these things are not stark choices. Mm-hmm. It can be one and the other, or one after the other. Where I think that leads us is yet another huge research program. And I guess those who are around the table looking for doctoral dissertations, there are a number of things there that are literally unexplored in the literature and that could make terrific research topics. I think we know very little about the sequencing and the impact of the sequencing between compliance process and peacebuilding. Because if and when we do them, it's often not the same actors doing them, and there's very little talk and coordination between the actors involved in them. So it seems to me that another kind of research that we need to do to understand these things, and where I would hope to go with this project, is to start thinking seriously about issues of sequencing and coordination among the various actors. Now everyone does their own thing. NGOs, societal actors, have initiatives. Often their own governments are not aware of what they're doing on the ground. And one thing that we know is that for these things to really have an impact, they should all be going in the same direction. They should be nudging the boat in the same direction. And so I think that there are serious analytical issues about sequence, coordination, that go way beyond what we think of as sequence and or coordination these days. Because we think of security, development, and democracy, which are very abstract. Here we're talking about, putting troops on the ground, bringing people into government, and, engaging groups in society. These are much more micro kinds of processes. And when we think about coordination now, when we talk about coordination, it's either among UN agencies or between the UN and major state donors. No one really seriously talks in academia about coordination between these groups and the array of non-state societal actors that are involved in peace processes. If they don't talk, they could be doing things in the wrong order, at the wrong time, or totally separate, and never shall the two meet. And I think that that's where I would go with this question, though I recognize that I don't have an answer to it. I have, a lot of questions that follow from your observation.
Well, I think you synthesized a huge amount of material wonderfully. That's amazing. Well, I have just one comment about the compliance process and peace building. It strikes me that governments have war departments, defense departments, and foreign ministries. They don't have peace building departments, and they don't have it for a very good reason. It's hard to get taxpayers to pay money to help other people solve their problems. And that's one reason I think that going in and getting out is what most government leaders have to think about if they want to remain leaders in their government. And that's why the NGOs have played such a big role there, because it's a vacuum. And what you were just saying about making more coordination, and some of that I think is beginning to go, the USAID, things get contracted out. But I think you pointed to that as a really important area that needs to be developed, and hopefully it's published that will have some impact on that, because you made a really good case, I think, why the other ones aren't necessarily limited because of the pressures from home bodies to bring the boys home.
Yeah. One thing I would say, I think, going alongside in the same direction in terms of my thinking about these issues is that you're absolutely right, we don't have peacebuilding departments. Although, interestingly, we're starting to develop peacebuilding either commissions at the UN, for example, or peacebuilding secretariats or small parts within, for example, State Department now has one. So I think that is interesting. That also worries me a bit, because the kind of societal transformation that is being pushed by the likes of USAID or whatever is the whole talk about democracy promotion, right? But we have a very specific way of thinking about democracy, which could also end up paralleling at the level of society what is happening with spoilers. We will, select in the people that we think look or think like us, and leave out the people who don't, but who might be the real people that we want in. And so I think that, again, there should be way more analysis and research and critical research on this. And on the connection, and this increasingly tight connection between aid agencies, which are becoming the peace-building departments by default within governments, and the NGOs that they are subcontracting, whereby the NGOs are losing a lot of the autonomy that they had before. And I think that that's also something that we see, that there's some good work coming out on, but not enough to really understand fully the implications. And call me, a believer in conspiracy theories or whatever, but democracy promotion scares me. It scares me because of the way in which it is being implemented and what it means in practice in some places. Not that I think that democracy is bad, far from it. The point is that I think that the way in which democracy promotion is being structured and the way in which the terms of the debate are being set might cause similar problems in terms of our engagement with the societies. We are trying to engage societies, but I think that we're not trying to engage them in the right way or necessarily for the right reasons.
Well, Dr. Zahar, thank you so much for coming and for this fantastic presentation and for getting us to think about these issues in a new way.